Now for our final team from Dobbs Ferry School in New York State in USA, the Master's School in Dobbs Ferry, sorry. Henry, Miranda, Noah and Noah, please come.
Hello, I'm Henry. This is Miranda, Noah, and Noah. If you get them confused, we do too. And we want to talk about our approach as Team USA to this problem, which we called Health Search, a desktop app for ranking hospitals.
So one of the things that we first did when we came together to do this model was figure out what the problem is actually asking us to do. And immediately we get together, analyze the problem, and then split up and do research and figure out how it is that we're going to conquer this problem. And one of the first things that we had to figure out in doing this was what is inevitable death, right? What does that actually mean? You know, it sort of seems simple, but might not necessarily be. And after doing a lot of research, we used that to calculate HSMRs, which Noah can tell you more about.
Really quickly, sorry. Just as a last thing, what we try to do with our modeling is to take an approach like the way that professionals do, right? So looking at the existing solutions to the problem in the world and to try to make it so that we have a solution which does things better than what you could already find out in the world.
Right. So for our first attempt at ranking hospitals, we first ranked hospitals based on HSMRs, or hospital standardized mortality rates, which is given by this equation, which is essentially the actual number of deaths at a given hospital over the predicted number of deaths at a given hospital. So the question that raises is, how do you calculate the predicted deaths? We did that using a logistic regression, which is essentially a computer learning algorithm which tries to find connections between given input variables and a binary output variable, in this case, whether a patient lives or dies. We built our regression using data from the New York State Sparks program, which was the most robust data set we could find, and we used a total of 7 variables, including age group, gender, and race, etc. Now, the problem we ran into was that the data we've had was extremely imbalanced, meaning very few people actually died. What that meant for our which was a bad thing in our case. What that meant was what our regression would do was it basically guessed that everyone would survive, which is extremely accurate. It was almost 99% accurate, but it's basically useless if you want to get different estimations for different hospitals. So what we had to do was we had to use an oversampling method to first create synthetic minority data, and then an undersampling method to essentially clean out noise and outliers created by the oversampling. And then we used an imbalanced weighting scheme which penalized the model or penalized the regression more for incorrect answers. After all this work, we decided that the HSMR model was not good enough because, for one, it didn't take into account whether a death was evitable or not. It didn't take into account disease severity or other information related to hospital quality. And also, even after the oversampling and undersampling, the model was not all that great at actually predicting whether someone died or not. So we decided to move on to a different model.
So like all the previous groups, we had a wealth of data at our hands that we had to use and quantify to create a quantitative value for hospital quality, and we chose these weights for the various variables and groups.
Right, so the problem that we ran into is that there's actually too much data when it comes to modeling these problems. It's really difficult to figure out how exactly each different factor, when you look at something like mortality rates, for example, where mortality can be caused by so many different things, it's hard to say what the actual underlying mortality rates are. So the way the data is reported, and particularly in the United States by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, includes lots of different subdivisions and measures of data, which each individually are not that useful, and it's extremely difficult to piece out by hand how much each of those affects something like hospital quality. So given that problem that we have 47 different metrics in 7 categories with an unclear relationship to hospital quality as a concept, our solution was to use a computational probability technique called latent variable modeling to infer how much each metric is affected by a hidden latent variable of hospital quality. So what that means is you can imagine that you have different measures of patient satisfaction or mortality that are all in these measured groups, one of these 7 groups. Now, if the hospital is worse in that area, is worse for mortality, then all of those mortality measures are likely to be worse, which means they vary together, that they correlate together. And what you can do with probability is to fit all those different distributions to your expected probabilities and try to see how much all those metrics move as a group between hospitals, which allows you to access an underlying score, which tells you, at least in theory, the quality and the amount that that hospital in particular has an effect on the data that you observe. Basically trying to see the hidden variable of quality based off of the observed metrics that you can see in the data.
So, like the SCIROs from Taiwan, we wanted to create a questionnaire that would allow our model to be personalized to the user. So what we have here is 7 questions, 3 of which pertain to the experience of a patient, 3 of which pertaining to the structure and effectiveness of a hospital, and 1 pertaining to the severity of symptoms. And what the user does is, on a scale of 1 to 5, they answer how important these things are to them. And then what we do in these equations that you see is we average them. We average the 3 ratings per group, and we redistribute the weights along a linear distribution, and that's what this large equation is on the bottom, so that we have more accurate weights that are more tailored to what the user needs. And this is an example of what our model outputs. First, you put in your address, and then you answer the 7-question questionnaire. And then what it does is it outputs 5 or however many hospitals ranked in order of their quality score based on our model.
So another problem that you run into attempting to use data in the real world is, 1, that a lot of it is missing, and 2, that it's in all sorts of different formats. So for example, with mortality, unless you're Noah Crooks, lower is better. But for some other factors like patient satisfaction, higher is better. And they're also reported in all different ways. So mortality weights are percentages, but patient satisfaction is a score out of 10, or in some surveys it's a score out of 8. And all those different scales make it really difficult to compare them on a one-to-one basis. So what we did is a process called mean standardization, where we convert all of these values to something called z-scores, which measure the number of standard deviations above or below the average value for that given metric the value observed at a hospital is. So it basically turns everything into a -1 to 1 scale that will allow you to compare disparate types of data that don't at all look the same, and then allows you to fit the computational latent variable model to data that otherwise has absolutely no resemblance to each other. So this is the final metric that we reach and use in ranking our model. What we do is we take the latent variable for each model, which you can see as alpha there in this equation, and then we multiply it by the weight and then sum over all those weights and divide by the total amount through all those weights. And then finally, we try to form a distribution where all the scores will be in a user-friendly format between 0 and 10, with the average score falling at 5. And generally, it fits a normal distribution, meaning that they all, that really good and really bad hospitals are quite rare, and just about average hospitals are what's normal.
So this is an example of 2 different aspects of our model. The first is the top 5 hospitals in the closest proximity, and as you can see, we have different cases. One using the weights that our model provides initially. The second, the prioritized S&E score, is for a patient who cares a lot about the structure and patient experience of a hospital. And the prioritized Q score is the severity of symptoms. So these scores really allow you to weigh your options and see, what hospital is best for you. And then in the second table here, what we've done is we've expanded our parameters to include all hospitals within 60 miles. So you're not selling yourself short if you want to a hospital with better quality that's a little farther away, you have that option, and you can compare more with this aspect of the model.
So after completing our model, and in part because we had sunk so much time into it, we felt that it was also a good idea to look at how a model like this could be expanded for use outside of just one individual making one decision. So for example, we look at some of the highest rated hospitals in our system, Park Place Surgical Hospital, the Mayo Clinic, and New England Baptist, and compare those to their overall status as considered sort of some of the national best hospitals in the United States as part of a way of testing the validity of the model and whether you could then use a model like this to rank hospitals nationally rather than just in a local area. And then what we do in the second figure here is we take the average score of different healthcare providers in each state, which then we show in a lithograph here, which allows you to see what the general quality is in all these areas. And some of the conclusions from this is that hospital quality is usually higher in richer areas, on the coasts, and poor in poor areas and in the south. And ideally, models like this, especially when applied to smaller regional areas, could let you see how different test cases in sociology might have different access to healthcare, ideally meaning that a model like this could have uses outside of just an individual making decisions. And finally, like we were saying at the beginning in our methodology, what we try to do is look at every different approach we could find out there, which in this case are these 4 ranking systems from Medicare, US News and World Report's Health Insight, and Leapfrog Group. And then we tried to figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of all of them were. So we saw that obviously more measures was better, that patient opinion survey data was critically important, and that missing data for individual measures, which in a lot of cases is just taken out, which means hospitals that underreport are not considered at all. We looked at systems that would impute that data, allowing you to compare hospitals, even those that don't have quite as much data as others. And then all these other factors, and our system there, Health Search, at least in our ranking with the factors that we pick, manages to beat these ones out. So we consider the strengths of our model to be the latent variable modeling that we use to access hospital quality, the weights being derived from authoritative sources and from the lots of holistic measures that we see in the data that we're using, that we modify the weight metric based on user input, and that we replace unknown measure data with national means when comparing hospitals, and also that our model avoids expert bias, which is a criticism of some other models that focus too much on either top surgeons or the rankings of those top surgeons, which introduces expert bias. And our weaknesses being that our model is probabilistic, meaning that the scores we obsess are not objective, they're just likely to be correct. That symptom severity is not directly correlated to outcomes. So just because a person feels bad when they go to the hospital doesn't necessarily mean that they're at more risk. That our weights obviously can never be 100% accurate, that we have a limited amount of information from the user, and that there's a lot of missing data all over the country no matter what source you use. So these are some of our references. And finally, we wanted to talk about our experience with math modeling. So between the 4 of us, we've done 12 of these competitions across 4 years. And these competitions have influenced our interest in going into math, physics, biology, and computer science. That the experience is a lot different from anything we've ever had in a class, and that we sort of have become lifelong friends through these, and we sort of push each other to do better. And what I wanted to also say is that the experience of coming here and being able to come here, especially because my family is from Australia, to be able to be here, and we're here for 2 weeks actually, to try to sightsee a little, has been one of the best experiences of my life, and that I really, really appreciate what this competition has done. So, thank you.